interest you, Holmes, I received a letter from an Inspector Watkins asking for your advice.
You received a letter from me. I don't understand.
It's to do with the Sidney Micklethwait affair.
Ah, Sidney Micklethwait, yes. Well, that man died twice.
Yes. The inspector thought you might be a tad reluctant, so he addressed the letter to me so that I could break the news. Or rather the request. Or rather break the news of the request.
Gently.
Yes.
Yes.
As calmly and as gently as possible.
Well done.
Thank you.
You know, Watson, I've been dreading the arrival of such a letter.
Have you, Holmes? Why? You didn't know he was going to write you?
Who else would he write to a man who died twice?
Well, if you put it that way, no one.
And somehow he expects this detective agency to solve the mystery of Micklethwait's double death.
I'm sure there must be a rational explanation, Holmes.
The newspapers are already in possession of that.
Then there must be an irrational explanation. And yes, the newspapers are already in possession of that. Yes.
I can't believe grown men would print such rubbish.
Well, it's time they were stopped.
Is it?
Yes, and you and I are going to put a stop to it.
We are we?
Yes.
In that case, Watson, you'd better read the good inspector's letter.
Well, not everything you hear in the newspaper is correct. The story really begins 3 months earlier, when the Sidney Micklethwait worked at the McMuckle Bank in London as an accounts manager.
London, but I thought Sidney Micklethwait lived in the country.
Oh yes. No, he did. He lived in a small rented cottage in the country with his wife, Isabel, and commuted by train every day.
How idyllic. Domestic bliss in suburbia.
Yes, but the reason for his untimely demise has to do with some unusual occurrence during his banking hours.
That sounds intriguing.
Sidney Micklethwait was an embezzler. Yes, yes. He was not as pure as the driven snow.
Yes, but who would we want to be driven to purity, I wonder?
Well, no one would.
If others are dependent on you, you have an obligation.
I suppose so.
If there are dependents and not parasites.
Quite. Shall I continue?
Please do. I was wondering why you stopped.
Sidney Micklethwait
Yes.
took money from an account belonging to the McDurks, disreputable family who are rumored to have their hooks in every unsavory pie.
Dear. Silly, silly Sidney. One must never steal from crooks.
Yes. He intended to use the money to gamble on the stock exchange and then returning it before anyone noticed it was gone.
Sounds like a plan.
The gamble did not pay off and Sidney lost the lot.
Deafening silence.
Sidney was worried at what the McDurks would do when they found out. Fearing the worst, he decided on suicide. He returned to his cottage with a large bottle of whiskey, and in the dusky haze of a September evening, Sidney went to nearby tidal wave, the River Rockingham, stole a rowing boat. He planned to drink himself into an alcoholic stupor while the outgoing tide carried the boat out to sea, fall over the side, and drown in the ocean.
Dutch courage, eh?
The outgoing tide carried the rowing boat down the river, Rockingham, and out to sea. As they drifted rapidly downstream, Sidney Micklethwait was seen by two people. The first was a fisherman called Amos Tabler. He knew Sidney had asked him what he was doing in the rowing boat. Sidney laughed and started singing a song about a mermaid. The second person he saw was a local policeman called P.C. Perkins. He also recognized Sydney and shouted at him to stop singing about a mermaid. Sydney shouted something back out to PC. PC Perkins could not make out what it was. Realizing something was amiss, PC Perkins proceeded rapidly to the nearest rowing boat and gave chase.
Oh, good for him.
Sadly, he could not catch up with him. Flow of the tide was too strong, and Sydney was last seen sitting in the back of the rowing boat drifting out to sea. The next day, the boat was found anchored 3 miles from the mouth of the River Rockingham. On board was an empty bottle of whiskey and some clothes belonging to Sydney: a coat, hat, trousers, shoes.
He partially undressed. That's unusual.
You think so? He was drunk.
Perhaps.
Day after, Sydney's body was found washed up on the shore. Funeral arrangements were quickly made, but the Reverend Pugh was reluctant to hold the service in the local church, it being suicide, and small service was held at the cottage.
Difficult to say. I'm not sure if that is unusual or not.
Yes, and it is difficult to say. There was a small service held at the cottage, and then the coffin was carried to the local cemetery and buried. Later, his widow Isabel tried to claim on Sydney's life insurance policy, but was told that he did not pay out for suicides.
Everyone knows that.
And that should have been the end of that.
Yes, alas, poor Sydney. We shall not see his like again. If only.
Less than a month later, after the funeral, Sydney had seen again. He was seated in the back of a rowing boat, drifting out to sea on the same outgoing tide, and singing the same refrain.
He should have refrained.
Yes. He was seen by his widow and the Reverend Pugh, who were walking by the river, and P.C. Perkins, who again proceeded rapidly to rowing the boat and give chase. P.C. Perkins got as far as the mouth of the river, but had to turn back because of a thick fog. He was afraid of being lost if he continued the seaworthy direction, being unable to see the shore or the stars.
It's understandable.
Yes. The rowing boat was found the next day, anchored in the approximately same location. On board were some of the clothes which Sydney was buried in. Sydney's distraught widow demanded that the coffin be dug up, and when it was found to be empty.
Interesting.
There was a journalist present, and that's when the story made the front page of the national newspapers. On the same day as the story broke in the Nationals, the chief executive of the life insurance company received a bottle of whiskey with seaweed wrapped around the neck.
Pay up, or else.
Yes. Listen here. The chief executive of the life insurance company wrote to the chief constable demanding something be done. Then the chief constable wrote to Inspector Watkins demanding something be done.
And now the inspector has written me demanding something.
Anything. The investigation is going nowhere.
Has the inspector been able to find anything new?
He questioned the widow, but she's still distraught.
Yes, it might be very difficult for her.
People tried to get her out of the house herself, but nothing seems to work. Even the Reverend Pugh's tried, helping.
Well, that was good of him.
Yes. He thought it would do her good to have a change of scenery, so he took her for quiet walks here and there, round the village, through the woods, down by the river, that sort of thing, and then Sydney sailed by.
Oh dear.
She's been more or less housebound ever since. The inspector could get nothing out of her.
We must be patient. Time is a great healer, Watson.
Yes. Yes, the inspector did manage to search the cottage from top to bottom, with her consent, of course.
Of course.
But he found nothing unusual.
Nothing.
The suicide note wasn't very helpful. It just rambles on about a Viking funeral. It makes no mention of the dreaded McDurks.
Sydney was trying to maintain the pretense of being as pure as that driven snow.
Looks like it. The inspector questioned the owner, the rowing boat, who told him that nothing had been changed, added, or removed.
Nothing.
He searched through both sets of clothes and found nothing in the pockets. He examined the coffin and found nothing except...
Except what?
He found 2 pieces of straw.
2 pieces of straw. Sydney only left those for us to clutch at.
And that's all the inspector could find, apart from Stevenson Jackson nearly missing the funeral.
Wait. Stephen Jackson? Who's that?
Stephen Jackson, fishing companion of Sydney's. He tends to fish ponds at the Rockhampton estate. Apparently he knows all there is to know about fish.
Fascinating. Is that all we have? 2 pieces of straw and an estate worker who can't seem to tell the time?
Well, there isn't much to go on, I'm afraid. What do you think we should do, Holmes?
Well, throw in the towel and retire. That's what I think we should do.
Oh, don't be ridiculous, Holmes.
I'm serious, Watson. This case could simply ruin us.
Oh, it can't be that bad.
If we can't find out how Sidney Micklethwaite managed to die twice, then it can. This is maddening. Maddening. So many questions, so few answers. It's the second trip down the river that I find so puzzling to begin with.
The second trip, not the first.
Well, no. There can be little doubt that poor Sidney did take his own life that night on the first trip.
Yes.
Who on board was with him the second time? Did someone disguise himself as Sidney in order to frighten the life insurance company to pay up? And if so, how did he get off that rowing boat? There could not be another boat waiting for him out at sea because of the fog, and nor could he swim to the shore.
Perhaps he waited for the fog to lift.
No, being risked, found out by rescuers. No, that's not the answer, Watson. This is maddening.
I know what you mean. How did Sidney Micklethwaite send a bottle of whiskey to the chief executive of the life insurance company?
How did he manage to get out of a coffin 6 feet underground? Watson, we better find a solution to this baffling mystery, or Sidney Micklethwaite will be taking a passenger with him the next time he goes down the river Rockingham. The chief executive of that life insurance company, methinks.
Oh, don't say that, Holmes. It makes my blood run cold.
Does it?
Yes, gives me the shivers.
I see. Wait, I see. Cold. Cold, yes, I see.
What's happening, Holmes?
Ice cold. How foolish of me.
What?
He became as pure as driven snow, Watson.
What are you rambling about, Holmes?
Watson, you've done it again! While I've been skating over a thin surface of trivia, you've plunged headfirst into the depths of this kaleidoscope curiosity and found the one clue that explains everything.
I have.
Yes, the key that unlocks this whole mystery.
What is it?
Ice.
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 What has ice got to do with anything?
Everything has to do with ice. Get your notebook and pencil. Now, I shall explain how and why Sidney Micklethwaite was murdered.
He was murdered?
Yes, I'm afraid so, Watson.
Oh. Okay. So it wasn't suicide?
No. Let us begin at the beginning. It begins when Sidney Micklethwaite lost the money he borrowed from the McDurk family. Fearing the worst, he flees from London and makes plans to disappear.
Suicide, you mean?
No. Sidney had no intention of killing himself. He just wanted to get the McDurk family off his back. The only way to do that was to fake his suicide.
How?
Well, by constructing an ice sculpture of a man in a seated position, of course. He then dressed the sculpture with a hat, a coat, the trousers and shoes you mentioned, and placed it all in a rowing boat.
He'd never get away with that.
But he did get away with it.
Oh, yes, so he did.
Or to be more accurate, Sidney and an accomplice got away with it.
Who?
Well, think about it, Watson. If you want to construct an ice sculpture, where would the place be to do it?
An ice house?
Correct, the ice house on the Rockhampton estate, to be exact.
Of course. Stephen Jackson.
Correct again, Watson.
He tends the fish ponds there, and they use fish ponds and the like to collect ice in the winter, to store in ice houses.
Which makes Stephen Jackson his accomplice.
But they were only fishing companions, weren't they, Holmes? They weren't close enough to commit a crime together, were they?
They didn't have to be bosom buddies, Watson, because Sidney Micklethwaite wasn't committing any crime. Think of it. All he was doing was throwing the McDurks off his trail. The worst that would happen would be that the owner of the rowing boat would be deprived of rightful property for a day or so. Nothing more sinister than that.
I suppose so.
And we shall see. If it was Stephen Jackson who was instrumental in forging this new reality, well...
You're being cryptic again, Holmes.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, Watson, but I must confess I am impressed by the ingenuity behind this deception. It is an illusion worthy of the French surrealists. Watson, picture the scene, will you? It's dusk. Light is falling. Along the bank of the River Rockingham walks Amos Taplow, heading for another evening's eel fishing, no doubt. What does he see? What does he hear? He sees a figure in a rowing boat drifting by, and he doesn't recognize the person on board. The light isn't good enough for that. He hears a voice. It sounds as if it's coming from the boat, and it sounds like Sidney Micklethwaite. Amos Taplow puts two and two together and believes he can see Sidney Micklethwaite in the passing rowboat.
What voice?
Sidney Micklethwaite's, of course. He was hidden on the opposite bank of the river with a megaphone.
No.
Yes. He projected his voice across the water towards Amos Taplow, and by raising the lowering of his voice, he made it sound as if he was passing by on board that same rowing boat.
Amos Taplow did not realize what was happening.
Well, apparently not, or perhaps he was unsure until the next day when he found out who was supposed to be on board that boat. Any remaining doubts would have vanished after that. But I fear I may be in error, Watson.
You, Holmes.
Yes. For this is not a case where 2 + 2 = 4. Think. More of a case of several fractions coming together to add up to 4, Watson.
Oh, yes, I see what you mean.
P.C. Watkins was fooled in exactly the same way. He saw and heard someone who could have only been Sidney Micklethwaite, but he wasn't sure of that at the time. It was only afterwards that he became certain, when all the known fractions were accumulated up.
Oh, my. Well, what about the anchor? Who anchored the rowing boat 3 miles from the mouth of the River Rockingham?
Oh, no, Watson, no one. The rowboat anchored itself.
How?
The rope attached the anchor to the rowing boat and was tied to a block of ice. So the anchor then hung over the side, and when the block of ice melted, the anchor was therefore released, fell overboard, and anchored the rowing boat 3 miles from the mouth of the river.
Amazing.
It is indeed quite remarkable. When the anchored rowing boat was found the next day, all that was discovered aboard was a pile of soggy clothes, an empty bottle of whiskey. All the fractions added up to 4. And everyone therefore assumed that Sidney Micklethwaite had drowned.
They were absolutely certain that they found his body, Holmes.
Well, yes, Watson, but that is true, even if Sidney Micklethwaite had not planned to die on that night.
I see. But Sidney Micklethwaite is dead, isn't he?
Sidney Micklethwaite chose the wrong accomplice.
What happened?
After launching the rowing boat and broadcasting various messages to Amos Taplow and P.C. Perkins, Sidney Micklethwaite was invited by his old fishing friend back to the Rockhampton estate to celebrate the success of their venture with some scotch on the rocks by the fish ponds. When Sidney was suitable jolly, he suddenly found himself drowning in the fish pond. And the following evening, as the tide was going out, his half-dressed body was launched into the River Rockingham.
That's why his body was found 2 days later.
Indeed, Watson.
Well, Holmes, that part of the story now makes sense, but there are other parts requiring explanation.
Indeed there are, Watson, indeed there are. And we shall begin with the second trip down the River Rockingham. Again, there was an ice figure on board that rowing boat, and again, there was someone with a megaphone on the opposite bank of the river. But this time, it was Stephen Jackson, who was lurking in the shadows. It was he who projected his voice across the river toward his accomplice on the opposite bank.
His accomplice?
Yes, Stephen Jackson chose the right accomplice where Sidney Micklethwaite did not. Mrs. Isabel Micklethwaite.
Good heavens!
They must have been lovers who saw a future together without Sidney. But we will come to that moment presently. For Stephen Jackson was unable to protect an exact likeness of Sidney's voice across the river. It did not need to be precise, since Isabel's distraught reaction ensured that the Reverend Pugh believed that the voice was Sidney and that he was in the rowing boat.
Ooh, what about P.C. Perkins?
Oh, P.C. Perkins was alerted to what was happening by Isabel's commotions with the Reverend Pugh. There was no need for Stephen Jackson to broadcast any message to him.
It makes sense.
And now all the fractions add up, Watson. Sidney Micklethwait and Stephen Jackson were fishing companions, sure. While Sidney was away in London, Stephen and Isabel must have become lovers. An unremarkable relationship amidst the grand scheme of things, one might say. Until, one day, Sidney returned home suddenly and said he had to leave the country for good. To do so, he would require money, and the only portable valuables were his wife's jewelry. Sidney planned to take them and start again somewhere else, and would send for her later if he was indeed successful.
She decided not to wait.
Indeed not. She did not want to be left penniless in a rented cottage somewhere, so something had to be done. And if something could be done to persuade the life insurance company to pay out for a suicide, that would be even better.
I see.
Sidney, he wasn't bothered about losing the money from the life insurance company, no. He was only interested in evading the dreaded McDurks. His wife's jewelry just provided all the money that he needed for his new life.
You haven't explained how the coffin came to be empty, Holmes.
Oh, the funeral service. That was held at the cottage. More of it at Isabel's insistence than Reverend Pugh's reluctance, I suspect. After the service, Isabel must have asked for one last moment alone with her husband. The room was emptied, and then Stephen Jackson appeared. Between them, they removed Sidney from the coffin, replaced him with blocks of ice. They had to be quick, and that's how they made their mistake, of course.
The straw in the coffin you mentioned.
Yes. The straw in the coffin, used to insulate the ice. They were careful, Watson, but there wasn't time to be careful enough, and they left behind 2 pieces of straw. And so, when the mourners returned to the room, the lid had been placed on top of the casket, it was secured, taken away to be buried in the cemetery, and by the time it was later dug up 1 month later, the ice had melted, leaked away through the small holes in the bottom of the casket.
Mate!
You must tell Inspector Watkins to have a closer look at the underside of that casket. Some earth may be obscuring the holes, but being the approximate color of wood, it might be difficult to see them at first.
I hope you don't mind me asking, Holmes, but are you certain that Sidney Micklethwait did not commit suicide? On the face of it, it looks as if he did, and his widow is completely distraught.
She's hiding her guilt behind a veil of grief, Watson. It isn't easy standing up in public and lying, you know.
But how can you be sure?
On the first trip, when Sidney Micklethwait is supposed to have committed suicide, his pockets were empty. Nothing was found in them, no documents, no loose change, no handkerchief, nothing.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It seems unlikely he would go to the trouble of emptying his pockets beforehand.
No.
No, I'm afraid poor Sidney was murdered, and Stephen Jackson and Isabel Micklethwait will be hanged for his murder, no matter how much I might admire their ingenuity.
I must say, Holmes, what a strange life you must lead. The people you admire most are in jail or hanged.
A depressing thought, it's true, but you're not awaiting any death sentence yourself, are you, old friend?
You're not saying you admire me, are you, Holmes?
Of course I am, Watson. After all, weren't you the one who found the vital clue?
Yes, I suppose I was.
You know, if you hadn't fallen through the ice, we never have known what really would have happened.
Very droll, Holmes. Very droll.